just as I have loved you, says the Lord. Alleluia, 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 alleluia.
The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Peter went up to Jesus and said, Lord, how often must I forgive my brother if he wrongs me? As often as 7 times? Jesus answered, Not 7, I tell you, but 77 times. And so the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who decided to settle his accounts with his servants. When the reckoning began, they brought him a man who owed 10,000 talents, but he had no means of paying. So his master gave orders that he should be sold, together with his wife and children and all his possessions, to meet the debt. At this, the servant threw himself down at the master's feet. Give me time, he said, and I will pay the whole sum. And the servant's master felt so sorry for him that he let him go and cancelled his debt. Now, as this servant went out, he happened to meet a fellow servant who owed him 100 denarii. And he seized him by the throat and began to throttle him. Pay what you owe me, he said. His fellow servant fell at his feet and implored him, saying, Give me time and I will pay you. But the other would not agree. On the contrary, he had him thrown into prison till he should pay the debt. His fellow servants were deeply disturbed when they saw what had happened, and they went to their master and reported the whole affair to him. Then the master sent for him. You wicked servant, he said, I cancelled all that debt of yours when you appealed to me. Were you not bound then to have pity on your fellow servant, just as I had pity on you? And in his anger, the master handed him over to the torturers till he should pay all his debt. And that is how my heavenly Father will deal with you, unless you each forgive your brother from your heart. The Gospel of the Lord. I think you've all heard the saying, never judge a person until you have walked a mile in their shoes. I think we're all familiar with that. A few nights ago, I was out with some friends for dinner, and in the restaurant that we were in, they had pictures of all these kind of wise sayings all around the place. And one of them really caught my attention. I just thought it was fantastic. It was this one. Before you judge a man, walk a mile in his shoes. After that, who cares? He's a mile away and you've got his shoes. I like that one better than the other one. Some time ago, I was on call to the hospital. And I got a call to go and to see an elderly man who was dying, not immediately, but he certainly wasn't in good shape. And normally, the on-call priest is only there for emergencies. That kind of normal things that if you want to speak to a priest or just kind of normal, then the hospital chaplain looks after you. But that won't be an immediate response. It'll only be when he is doing his rounds and reaches that particular ward. So the on-call priest is there for emergencies and for people who are imminently dying. So the nurse who called me, she explained that this was not an emergency. And they did not believe that the man was going to die anytime soon, although his illness would eventually lead to his death. But she said, Father, having spoken to him, I really, really believe that he needs to see a priest, and he needs to see him now. And if we don't get a priest to him now, I don't think he will speak to a priest again. I think he'll lose courage. So I accepted their judgment, and I got over to the hospital. And there I met this elderly man who was obviously not very well. And he started to tell me his story. And he was explaining to me, he says, when I was a young man, I went to Mass every Sunday. I prayed, I had a rhythm of prayer every day of my life. The church was really important to me. He says, I strived to live my life according to gospel values. And then he went on to explain that he fell in love with this woman who eventually would become his wife. And that his desire before he proposed to her was that he bought an engagement ring and he wanted that ring blessed, just as a sign of his love and his faith in God. So he bought the engagement ring. And then he went on to describe that how one night he was out with his friends at a local pub. And as they left the place, and by his own admission, he said, I had a few drinks in me. But it kind of gave him courage, and he went to the priest at 11 o'clock at night to get him to bless the ring. Now, you can imagine the priest's reaction. A health warning. Do not come to me at 11 o'clock at night if you want a good reaction. You know, but in a sense, this is where the tragedy begins. Because the man was so hurt by the priest's reaction, who, by the way, told him to get lost, come back another time, that he wouldn't bless the ring just now. And he was so hurt by that. Now, sitting here, we might think, that's a bit trivial. You know, but don't judge till you've walked in their shoes. For this man, this was huge. And a tragedy happened then. He fell out with a priest, obviously, but he fell out more seriously with the church and with God. I mean, this is just tragic. Having listened to the story, I wish the priest had just swallowed his pride and blessed the ring. He was so angry. He could not let this go. And that bitterness that he felt inside himself just grew and grew and grew. And eventually he got married, but as he started to go through life, the bitterness just became more than just the church and God and the priest. It spread to everything in his life. He was bitter about everything. And there came a point in his life, to try to ease the pain of the bitterness, he turned to alcohol. And eventually, he lost control of that. And in time, he became unreliable in his job, and he lost his job. And eventually, his wife left him. Had only the priest blessed the ring. You know, this was just tragic to listen to. And as the man talked, I could hear he was still angry at that priest. I could hear the regret as he told this story of his life. And I could not help but wonder, why did you give this priest this power over your life? You know, please don't ever do that. Don't ever let anyone have that kind of power over you, where you refuse to forgive
person who really suffers most is you. You know, it struck me that his refusal to forgive the priest probably meant nothing to the priest. You know, he would go back up. He might have struggled to get back to sleep for a while. He would get up the next day, maybe grumping and moaning about this guy that turned up at the door at 11 o'clock at night. After that, it would be forgotten. The priest would go on with his life. But this man carried his resentment like a millstone round his neck for the rest of his days, till he ended up lying in hospital, dying with all this bitterness and anger inside himself. You know, a health warning. The refusal to forgiveness could cause serious issues in your life. It causes stress. It causes depression. It can make you physically ill. So be careful. If you're holding on to a resentment, be careful. You're playing with fire. But when you have the ability to forgive, you know, that's a gift that keeps giving. And it gives, perhaps to the other person that you need to forgive, the freedom to change their way of life. Perhaps. But that's their problem. But it gives you the freedom not to be living your life as a victim. That you can let it go and live your life to the fullness. You know, the refusal to forgive is like putting yourself in the hands of a jailer who locks you away in the jail of bitterness. Forgiveness is the key of release. Forgiveness is the key that unlocks the door of resentment and the handcuffs of hatred. So there is a lot riding on this teaching of Jesus to forgive. But I think there's a problem about forgiveness, which kind of helps us not to forgive. And it's something that we've learned from our earliest days, and it's a lie. And that's the notion that to forgive, you need to forget. That's not only a lie, it's unhelpful. And it's not what Jesus calls us to. Jesus always calls us to live in the truth. So to do this notion of pretending to forget is not living in the truth. It's denying the truth. You know, it's really important that we understand that. That we stay in the truth, that we acknowledge the hurt that has been given, that we see it for what it is, and we learn from it. We learn the lesson of the hurt. That takes courage, and it takes strength. And I think it's tied up with this notion that forgiveness means reconciliation, and they are two different concepts. Forgiveness is the ability to let go of the resentment. Reconciliation means we return to where we were before the hurt was inflicted. Now, sometimes that is not possible, and sometimes it is not desirable. If someone is hurting you badly, you should never put yourself back in a dangerous situation and claim it's forgiveness. Forgiveness is acknowledging the truth of the circumstances, and that might mean that you can't be reconciled. You can't go back to where you were, but you can forgive. I heard a kind of silly example of how this might play out. There are some serious examples, but a kind of silly example. Imagine I have a friend who comes to me wanting to borrow my car. And I say, of course, no problem. And they take my car out, put it round a lamppost. And they come back and they say, really, really sorry, I had an accident. You know, and my first reaction will be, are you okay? Because he's my friend. Are you okay? And then don't worry about it. It's only a chunk of metal. That's why I pay insurance. It'll be fine. Don't worry. Everything's hunky-dory. So we get that all sorted out. And then sometimes later, he comes back another time and he says, can I borrow your car? And I think, okay, you know, he's my friend. So yeah, on you go. Accidents happen, you know. He'd be really unlucky. And he goes out and he takes my car and has another accident. And he comes back and he says, Mama, oh, you're my friend. I might be a bit annoyed at you this time, you know. But okay, it's all right. So we get the car fixed. Then he comes back a third time. And he says, can I borrow your car? And I say, not a chance. Why? Because I'm acknowledging the truth. And I don't want him to have the car, particularly for two reasons. First of all, and perhaps more importantly, my premium has gone through the roof. But secondly, I want to protect him because he's obviously a bad driver. So I've learned from the circumstance, I don't lose his friendship by not allowing him to have the car. I'm just acknowledging the truth of the circumstances. So what we're being taught today in the gospel is that forgiveness is compulsory. Reconciliation is optional. It depends on the circumstances of the event. We need to forgive, both for the other person's benefit, but also for our own benefit. But we might not be able to go back to where we were before the hurt was inflicted. But also we learned something today about how God forgives. We hear this parable of the steward, and he owes 10,000 talents. You know, that would be 150,000 years' worth of your daily wage. This is impossible to pay back. This man can never pay this back. And even when he pleads with him and he says, look, I'll pay it, give me time and I'll pay it back, that ain't going to happen because you're not going to live for 150,000 years. It's not going to happen. And what does the master do? He doesn't say, okay, let's work out a payment plan. He cancels the debt. It's gone. You know, the man then goes on, we're told, to hear about a fellow servant who owes him effectively £5,000. And he refuses to cancel his debt. But what we hear in that parable is that, you know, when God forgives, he cancels our debt. There is not a sin in our life, no matter how serious that is, that God doesn't desire to cancel the debt. But here's the thing with God. Whereas with us, reconciliation is optional, it's not with God. He wants to restore us to where we were before the sin. And where we were before sin was we are his sons and his daughters. And he wants that restored if we want it restored. But he offers it always. So God's love is always there, willing to forgive, to cancel our debt. Pope Francis says this: God never tires of forgiving us, But we are the ones who tire in seeking his mercy. For whatever reason, we hold back going to God and asking for his mercy. But God never tires in forgiving us. And I think that's why when Jesus was teaching us to pray, he included the line, "Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us." Jesus is giving us a rule of life. So what about the man in the hospital, you're wondering? Well, after we talked this story through, which took some time, let me tell you, he asked to go to confession. Now, I'm not going to tell you because the seal wouldn't allow me what he confessed. But it was a beautiful confession. And it came to the time for a penance. I asked him if he would be willing and able to pray for that priest who was now dead. And he said to me, "Yes, Father, it's time to let that go. I can do that." So then I prayed over them the words of absolution. And there were tears running down his cheeks. And then after confession, I offered him Holy Communion. For the first time in all these years. And he took Holy Communion, and physically he changed. You could see in his face that the first time since that night he went to get the wedding ring blessed, or the engagement ring blessed, for the first time in all that time, he was now at peace with God and with himself.